Bobcat hit by car. Tiny kitten guards. It then a rescue gives a grieving man new purpose. Snow fell heavily outside the old wooden window, transforming Maple Hollow Road into a landscape of white silence. Arthur Hayes, 76 years old, sat by the fireplace in his Vermont cabin, the folded letter to his granddaughter Emma resting on the table like a final verdict. The words inside announced his decision: sell the cabin, leave this place, end the solitary days in the deep forest. He believed his story had reached its conclusion, but the fireplace offered no real warmth that day. The flames consumed seasoned oak logs, yet something within Arthur remained frozen a cold that had settled into his bones 2 years ago when Nora, his calico companion of 17 years, passed away on a quiet September morning. Since then, he had been merely existing, moving through routines without purpose, waiting for an ending he lacked the courage to name. Arthur stood, joints protesting, and pulled on his heavy coat. He needed more firewood from the stack beside the tool shed. Just as his hand touched the doorknob, a sound shattered the muffled quiet of falling snow. Skreech up, Mister! The screech of car brakes cut through the winter air, followed immediately by the roar of an engine accelerating away into the distance. Arthur's heart lurched. He yanked the door open and stumbled into the biting cold, his wool socks quickly soaking through. On the road, tire tracks carved dark lines through fresh powder, disappearing around the bend. The vehicle was gone, but it had left something behind. Two small figures collapsed in the middle of the road. A bobcat lay on its side, blood spreading through the snow like terrible red roots. Beside it, a tiny white kitten pressed against the larger animal's fur, trembling and crying out in weak, desperate sounds. As Arthur approached, something extraordinary happened. The kitten, despite its own injury, a bleeding front leg that should have made movement agonizing, suddenly sprang up. It planted itself between Arthur and the bobcat, fur bristling, and released a faint growl that was pure determination despite obvious terror. Arthur froze, his hand extended in the air. The gesture pierced something deep in his chest. This was exactly how Nora had stood as a kitten when a neighbor's aggressive doing had invaded their yard decades ago, a small body planted firm, willing to fight despite impossible odds. The memory hit Arthur with physical force. But what happened next would become the image burned into his mind forever. The kitten tried to pull the bobcat to safety. Its tiny jaws clamped onto the bobcat's thick neck fur, and it pulled backward with everything it had. Its small paws slipped and slid on the blood-stained snow. Pull, slip, fall, get up, pull again. The kitten weighed perhaps 2 pounds. The bobcat weighed 40. The mathematics made the attempt absurd. The love made it holy. Arthur watched this impossible effort, this physical weakness matched against monumental will, and felt something crack open inside him. How long had it been since he had cared about anything enough to try the impossible? "It's okay, little one," Arthur whispered, his voice rough. "I'm here to help, I promise." He lifted the bobcat first, cradling the injured wild animal against his chest, feeling its rapid heartbeat. He carried it carefully to the cabin and laid it on the braided rug before the fireplace. Then he returned for the kitten, which had finally collapsed from exhaustion in the depression where the bobcat had been. Arthur gathered the small white body into his arms. "Skreech," he murmured. "Yes, you will be called Skreech." That screech of brakes had led him to find them, and somehow he knew it would be the sound that brought his remaining life back to life. The drive to Franklin's veterinary clinic took 40 minutes through worsening snow. Arthur spoke to both animals the entire way, telling them about Nora, about his years teaching 3rd grade, about anything that came to mind, as if his voice alone could anchor them to life. Franklin had been Arthur's friend for 30 years, running his converted farmhouse clinic with quiet competence. When Arthur pushed through the door carrying a wild bobcat with a kitten tucked inside his coat, Franklin's eyes widened, but his professional instincts took over immediately. As Franklin examined the bobcat's shoulder wound, he paused, studying the animal with undisguised admiration. She was a female, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, with thick fur that seemed to glow like embers under the fluorescent lights. Black spots and stripes ran down her legs in intricate patterns. Even injured, she possessed undeniable grace. When her eyes flickered open briefly, they were stunning amber brown that glinted like polished metal. "Wow," Franklin breathed. "She's beautiful." Arthur nodded, watching his friend work. Franklin cleaned the wound carefully, preparing sutures. "This looks like a vehicle impact, probably a side mirror. She's going to need antibiotics and time. What are you calling her?" Arthur hesitated. He studied the wound placement on the Bobcat's right shoulder and realized something crucial: the kitten had been on her left side, away from impact. She had shielded Skreech with her own body, taking the hit meant for both of them. "Freya," Arthur said quietly. Franklin looked up, a knowing smile touching his lips. "Freya, the guardian goddess. If she's a warrior protecting the helpless, she deserves a warrior's name." When Freya was lightly sedated for stitching, something remarkable occurred. Even under medication's influence, she turned her head with effort toward where Skreech lay on an adjacent table and licked the wound on the kitten's belly. The gesture was instinctive, yet profound. Arthur stood motionless, witnessing this bridge between wild and domestic, between species that should have been strangers. Franklin pulled off his surgical gloves. "This is extraordinary, Arthur. She's not just tolerating him. She's mothering him." He paused. "I've seen cross-species nursing before, but a wild bobcat caring for a domestic cat, that's something else entirely." 3 days after bringing them home, Arthur received a call from Franklin. "I reviewed footage from the state conservation camera near your property. You need to see this." The video file showed grainy night vision footage dated 2 weeks before the accident. Freya moved through pine forest, but her gait was wrong heavy, pained. Her belly was visibly swollen with pregnancy. The camera angle shifted, revealing blood traces, scattered fur, coyote tracks. Freya lost her litter to a coyote pack, Franklin explained over the phone. And around that time, someone reported a vehicle stopped near mile marker 7. The conservation officer found an abandoned cardboard box. "Someone dumped a kitten in winter," Arthur said, his voice hard. "Keep watching." The next section, dated days later, showed Freya lying under a bush, her body language radiating exhaustion and grief. Then a tiny white kitten crawled into frame, moving slowly through snow. It was calling out weak sounds, barely registering on the camera's audio. Freya lifted her head, sniffed. The kitten came closer, trembling, crying. Not for food, but with the desperation of a creature dying from cold and abandonment. Then Freya slowly rolled onto her side and allowed the kitten to nurse. Arthur stared at the screen, his vision blurring. She couldn't leave it to die. Franklin's voice was gentle. A dying child appeared right after she lost her own babies. Her maternal instinct wouldn't allow her to turn away, even though this kitten wasn't her species, wasn't her own. She chose to save it. After the call ended, Arthur sat in the quiet cabin for a long time. He thought about loss and love and the strange ways life offers second chances. Freya had chosen to mother an abandoned kitten when her own heart was breaking. If a wild animal could make that choice, could open herself to love again after devastating loss, then perhaps there was still hope for a stubborn old man. Over the following weeks, Skreech transformed Arthur's existence in unexpected ways. The kitten was clever and playful, developing habits that brought laughter back into the cabin. Arthur installed a small bell beside Skreech's food bowl, thinking the kitten might signal when hungry. Within 2 days, Skreech had learned to press it with his paw, and the bell rang constantly morning, noon, night, and midnight. At first, Arthur rushed to check each time. Then he realized Skreech simply enjoyed making the old man come running. The bell drove him crazy, but it was a beautiful kind of crazy, the kind that reminded Arthur he was still alive enough to be irritated, still present enough to feel. For 2 years, he had felt nothing. No anger, no chewing, no annoyance. The absence of feeling had been a kind of death. Skreech was dragging him back to life, one irritating bell ring at a time. Every evening, Arthur began reading aloud the same fairy tales and folk legends he had once shared with third graders. Skreech would curl in his lap, ears flicking forward as if genuinely listening. Arthur told him about Anansi the spider, Brer Rabbit, the Selkie wives. Sometimes Skreech would purr, a sound like a small motor vibrating against Arthur's chest. One afternoon, feeling playful for the first time in years, Arthur made a wooden sign labeled Cabin Rules and hung it by the door. In his neat teacher's handwriting, he wrote no shedding fur on the leather armchair, no fighting in the kitchen, no ringing the bell at 5 a.m. The next morning, he found Skreech sprawled across the small table beneath the sign, one white paw placed directly over the rules. Arthur laughed out loud. Protest registered. Freya healed slowly, restless in captivity, though never aggressive toward Arthur. She groomed Skreech meticulously and allowed the kitten to sleep against her belly at night, but distance remained in her amber eyes apart, unreachable, forever wild. One early March morning, Arthur woke to find the recovery room door open and Freya gone. She had worked the old latch and returned to the forest. Arthur's heart sank, but he understood. She was a wild creature who had accepted temporary sanctuary while healing. Nothing more. Days later, she returned. This became her pattern, coming and going as she pleased, staying a few days before disappearing into the trees. And then, 3 weeks after her first return, Arthur noticed her belly rounding again. She was pregnant when her litter of bobcat kittens was born in early May, tucked into the back corner of the recovery room closet that Freya had claimed as her den. Arthur felt a profound sense of witnessing something sacred. There were 3 kittens, tiny and spotted, their eyes still closed. Freya was an attentive mother, fierce and protective, and for the first few days, she wouldn't let Arthur near them, but she allowed Skreech to approach, and the white kitten would sit near the closet entrance, as if standing guard over his adopted siblings. As the bobcat kittens grew, and their eyes opened, and they began to stumble around on wobbly legs, Arthur observed their behavior with the same careful attention he had once given to his students' development. Freya began to teach them, and her methods were fascinating. She would drag stuffed toys from the living room, Arthur's old things from when his own children were young, and lay them in front of each little cub. She would demonstrate stalking behavior, her body low to the ground, moving in slow motion. The kittens would watch, then try to imitate her, pouncing on the stuffed animals with varying degrees of success. One afternoon, Arthur caught one of the kittens, a particularly bold male, biting and clawing at the leg of a large stuffed bear that had been his son's childhood toy. The kitten was growling, shaking its head, completely committed to the hunt. Arthur shook his head and muttered, "You guys are hunting IKEA now." But he left the toys where Freya had placed them. Understanding that this was important, this was how she was preparing her babies for the life they would eventually need to lead in the wild. Each evening, Arthur read aloud in his armchair. Skreech curled in his lap as always. But now the bobcat kittens tumbled out from the recovery room to settle on the rug at his feet, heads lifted, ears perked. Arthur read with the same inflection and expression he had used in his classroom, doing different voice, pausing for dramatic effect. The kittens reacted, ears swiveling, eyes widening. During a suspenseful part of Where the Wild Things Are, Luna chirped, and Arthur had to stop reading because he was laughing too hard. The cabin transformed. Arthur sketched each kitten, adding notes about their personalities, and hung the drawings on the walls. He set up a small chalkboard in the kitchen corner, writing daily observations. Today's lesson, why wrestling is important, or advanced stalking, use of cover and concealment. That spring, an envelope arrived with handwriting that trembled slightly, the mark of aged hands. Arthur opened it carefully. Dear Mr. Hayes, you may not remember me. I was Sarah. In your 3rd grade class 20 years ago, I was 8 years old, struggling with reading, convinced I was stupid. You stayed after school every day to help me. You never made me feel broken. You said I was worth the effort. Last month, I graduated from medical school. Yesterday, I saved a 7-year-old boy's life in the emergency room, and all I could think was Mr. Hayes taught me I was worth saving, so I could learn to save others. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Arthur folded the letter, wiping his eyes. Sarah. He remembered her, the quiet girl who had flinched at loud noises, who came to school in the same clothes too many days in a row, who believed she was worthless because that's what she had been told at home. Arthur had fought for that girl and had seen the brilliant mind beneath the pain. He sat at his kitchen table, holding that letter, thinking about Freya refusing to abandon a dying kitten even as her own heart broke. About Skreech trying to drag a bobcat to safety despite impossible odds. About all the students he had believed in when they couldn't believe in themselves. This was why he couldn't give up. Not on Skreech, not on Freya and her kittens, not on the belief that showing up matters, that caring heals both the giver and the receiver. That evening, Arthur looked at the letter to Emma still sitting on the table, the letter announcing he would sell the cabin. He picked it up, carried it to the fireplace, and stood there for a long moment, watching Skreech sleep curled against Freya's side. Maybe it's not the cabin that grew old, Arthur said quietly to himself. Maybe it was my heart that went cold. He dropped the letter into the flames and watched it curl and blacken. Then he knelt beside Skreech and stroked the white cat's head gently. We're staying, he whispered, at least until you don't need me anymore. Maybe longer. But Arthur knew, even then, that the truth was more complicated. It wasn't about Skreech needing him. It was about Arthur needing to be needed, needing to matter, needing to remember that caring for others is what makes us human. As summer arrived, the bobcat cubs grew strong and their wild nature asserted itself more forcefully. They needed space the cabin couldn't provide, needed to learn skills only the forest could teach. Freya began taking them outside for longer periods, and Arthur watched through binoculars as she taught them patience. Tree climbing, the explosive pounce bobcats used to catch prey. One autumn morning, they didn't return. Arthur waited all day, all night. By the second day, he understood. Freya had decided her kittens were ready. They had returned to the wild, to the life they were meant to live. The loss ached, but differently than losing Nora. This was bittersweet, the feeling of having loved something enough to let it go. He had helped raise these kittens and had been part of their lives during their most vulnerable months. Now they were out there living as bobcats should live. Skreech felt the absence too, wandering restlessly for days, checking old sleeping spots, calling out with plaintive meows. But gradually, he settled back into routine with Arthur, and the cabin grew quiet again. That winter, when the first real snow fell in November, Arthur found fresh bobcat tracks on his porch steps. They were smaller prints from a younger bobcat, probably one of Freya's kittens, with larger tracks beside them. Freya had come back, just to visit, just to leave this silent greeting. Arthur stood at the window with his coffee, watching the tracks disappear into the tree line, and smiled. He opened his leather-bound journal, the one Margaret had given him years ago that he had barely touched since her death, and wrote, "Small paws, big heart." This became the pattern of his life. Freya visited a few times each year, sometimes alone, sometimes with her grown kittens. They never stayed long and kept their distance, more wary now as fully wild creatures. But they came, and that was enough. About 2 years after the accident, Jennifer Whitmore from the town council visited. "Mr. Hayes, we're establishing a wildlife rehabilitation center. We have funding but need someone experienced to run it. Dr. Franklin recommended you." Arthur was taken aback. "I'm just an old teacher who got lucky." "You're more than that," Jennifer said firmly. "You took in injured animals, helped them heal, then released them back to the wild. That's exactly what rehabilitation is, and Dr. Franklin says you have a gift for it." Arthur looked at Skreech in his lap. He thought about Sarah's letter, about all the years teaching children, believing in them. Maybe this was just another form of teaching, another way to matter. What would it involve over the following months? Arthur's cabin officially became a wildlife rescue station. With the town's help, he built proper enclosures, installed better heating, and set up a small medical treatment area. He took courses on wildlife rehabilitation, studied nutrition for different species, and learned legal requirements. They named it Freya's Haven, and it opened that autumn. The local newspaper ran a story with a photo of Arthur on his porch holding Skreech. Within weeks, he was getting calls about injured raccoons, orphaned foxes, birds with broken wings, even a young black bear caught in barbed wire. Arthur discovered his teaching skills translated perfectly. He worked with volunteers, explaining animal behavior, teaching proper handling techniques, emphasizing the importance of minimizing human contact so animals could return to the wild successfully. He gave talks at schools with the same enthusiasm that had made him a beloved teacher decades ago. Skreech became the unofficial mascot, greeting visitors fearlessly. Arthur noticed injured animals often seemed calmer when Skreech was nearby, as if the cat's peaceful presence helped them feel safe. But Freya's haven wasn't just for animals. Lonely people found their way there too. Elderly residents stopped by to help with feeding, finding purpose in caring for creatures that needed them. Troubled teenagers volunteered, discovering that nurturing injured animals helped heal their own emotional wounds. The cabin became a community hub in ways Arthur had never anticipated. Time continued its march. Arthur's hair turned completely white. His joints grew stiffer. His hands developed the tremor that comes with age. But the most significant change came gradually. His vision began to deteriorate. It started with difficulty reading small print, then progressed to trouble with details at a distance. Colors became less vibrant, edges less sharp. Dr. Franklin referred him to specialists. The diagnosis was macular degeneration, progressive and irreversible. The day Arthur could no longer read his journal was the day everything changed. He sat at his desk, staring at the page, trying to force the letters into focus. But they remained a blur, meaningless shapes mocking him. Panic rose in his chest, cold, suffocating panic. Reading had been his anchor through every difficult period of his life. Margaret's death, Nora's passing, the lonely years he had written through all of it. Now even that was being taken away. He sat there, hands shaking, feeling the darkness closing in. Not just the darkness of failing vision, but the deeper darkness of purposelessness, of becoming a burden, of no longer being able to contribute. Then he felt a soft touch against his hand. Skreech, now an older cat himself, pressed his head against Arthur's palm and purred. That familiar rumbling sound, unchanged by time, reminded Arthur that he was not alone. All the days that followed, Skreech gradually became more than a companion. He became Arthur's eyes. The white cat, who had grown up in the cabin and knew every inch of it, began to guide Arthur through his daily routines. When Arthur would rise in the morning, disoriented by the darkness that his failing vision imposed on the world, Skreech would meow and rub against his legs, leading him step by step to the bathroom, then to the kitchen. The cat learned to alert Arthur to obstacles, walking ahead and then stopping to wait. His white fur just visible enough in Arthur's peripheral vision to serve as a guide. He would tap Arthur's leg with his paw when there were stairs ahead, would vocalize when something had been left on the floor that Arthur might trip over. Every morning, Skreech would perform the same ritual he had done for years. He would tap Arthur's cheek gently with his paw. The claws carefully retracted, a soft and insistent touch that said it was time to wake up, time to start the day. Arthur would wake to that familiar sensation, unable to see his friend clearly, but feeling the love in the gesture. "Once upon a time, I pulled you out of the snow," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Now you're leading me through the darkness. How did that happen?" But he knew the answer. This was what love looked like. This was the circle completing itself. For years, Arthur had been the teacher, the caretaker, the one who gave now in his greatest vulnerability. Skreech was teaching him the final lesson that accepting care with grace is as important as giving it. "All my life, I was the teacher," Arthur said one evening, his hand resting on Skreech's head. "I suppose I still am. Except now my student is a white cat who's become wiser than his old teacher, with volunteers managing daily operations." Arthur continued contributing in ways he could. He couldn't see animals clearly, but he could hear them, could discuss behavior and care, and could share stories about the various creatures they had helped. His experience and knowledge remained valuable, even as his eyes failed him. One autumn day, knowing his time grew shorter in the way old people sometimes sense, Arthur dictated a letter to Jennifer. He recounted the whole story, the screech of brakes on a snowy March day, the Bobcat and Kitten lying injured in the road, the months of healing and teaching and learning, the miracle of Freya's maternal love for a kitten that wasn't her own. "If anyone reads these words," Arthur concluded, "please be kind to any guest that comes from the forest. Wild things are not so different from us. They love, they grieve, they make choices about who to save and who to care for. They deserve our respect and compassion. Jennifer placed the letter in a waterproof container and hid it under a loose floorboard in the cabin. Then Arthur turned to Skreech in his lap, stroking the old cat's familiar shape. "Just in case I can't tell you myself how much you've meant to me," he murmured. "How you saved my life, just as surely as I saved yours." The years that followed brought a gentle rhythm. Arthur moved more slowly, needed more rest, but found that age had brought peace he had never known in youth. Volunteers managed most operations, but Arthur remained the heart of Freya's haven, the keeper of its stories and spirit. Freya continued her visits, and though she was older now, her movements still held grace. Sometimes Arthur would wake to find her sleeping on the porch, as if she had come to check on him during the night. One particular winter morning, Arthur woke to Skreech's familiar paw tap on his cheek. He smiled, reaching out to stroke the old cat. Through the blur of his vision, he could just make out the white shape of Skreech, and beyond him, through the window, snow falling once again. Jennifer arrived with news a donor had come forward with funding to expand Freya's haven, to build better facilities and help more animals. Arthur listened, offering suggestions, his mind still sharp even as his body grew frailer. That afternoon, as Arthur sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, he heard familiar paws on snow. Freya emerged from the tree line, moving more carefully with age but still beautiful. Behind her came Saga, her cautious daughter who had inherited her mother's wisdom. They approached and settled in their usual spots close enough to be present, far enough to remain wild. Arthur couldn't see them clearly, but he knew they were there. He could hear their breathing, could sense their presence the way you sense beloved family even in darkness. "Still here," he said softly. "We're all still here." What happened next would become the moment Arthur treasured most. Another sound emerged from the forest, smaller paws. Multiple sets. Saga had brought her own kittens, 3 young bobcats experiencing their first winter. They approached tentatively, curious about this strange old human their grandmother and mother trusted. Arthur sat very still, hardly breathing. Through the blur of his vision, he could just make out their shapes in the snow. 4 generations Freya, who had lost her first litter and saved an abandoned kitten. Saga, who had been raised alongside a domestic cat. And now these new kittens. Learning that this cabin was a place of safety, Jennifer stood at the window, watching this scene, her phone recording. Later, she would write in the Freya's Haven Journal, Day 1, 8/25, the first snowfall reunion. They came back, all of them. They remembered. That evening, Arthur sat in his armchair with Skreech purring in his lap. The fire crackled warmly. Through the window, he could sense, rather than see, Freya and her family at the forest edge, keeping their eternal vigil. "Do you understand what we did?" Arthur asked Skreech. "We built a family, not from blood, but from choice, from showing up when it mattered, from refusing to give up on each other." Skreech's purr deepened, the sound vibrating through Arthur's chest like an answer. Outside, volunteers were finishing evening tasks, their voices carrying through the cold air laughter and conversation. The sounds of community and purpose. Inside, rescued animals rested in warm enclosures, healing under careful watch, and at the edge of the forest, wild bobcats kept vigil over the strange old man who had once saved their matriarch. Arthur thought about Sarah's letter, about all his former students now grown with children of their own. He thought about the circle of giving and receiving, teaching and learning, saving and being saved. He had spent his life believing that caring for others gave life meaning. Only now, in his twilight years, had he learned the deeper truth that allowing ourselves to be cared for, to be vulnerable, to accept help, this too is a gift we give. Life begins when we stop running from pain and start listening to what's calling us. He whispered into Skreech's fur. "Family isn't blood, it's choice. And caring heals both ways, the one who gives and the one who receives." Freya's haven continued to operate. Each winter, when the snow fell thick and heavy on Maple Hollow Road, small footprints would appear outside the cabin that now served as the main office of Freya's haven. Bobcat tracks, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs or groups, leading right up to the porch steps. The volunteers would find them in the morning and smile, understanding that Freya's descendants were keeping the tradition alive, checking on the place that had once been their sanctuary. And Skreech, a wise elder cat, had become a healer in his own right. Whenever volunteers brought in newly rescued animals, frightened and hurting, Skreech would approach slowly and touch their faces with his paw gentle, reassuring, the same gesture Arthur had used when he first touched an injured kitten in the snow. Arthur, meanwhile, watched his grown kid welcoming them with pride, now in the cabin on Maple Hollow Road, where the fire still burns warm each winter evening. Arthur sits in his old armchair with Skreech purring in his lap. Sometimes, through the window, he senses Freya watching from the forest edge, keeping vigil over the family she chose that snowy day so many years ago. They are all still here, connected by bonds that formed in a moment of crisis and grew into something transcendent, proof that love crosses all boundaries between human and animal, domestic and wild, teacher and student, the one who saves and the one who is saved. And on quiet evenings, you can hear an old man's voice reading fairy tales to whoever will listen. The story continues, written in paw prints in the snow and in the gentle touch of healing hands, a testament to second chances in the families we choose when we stop running from pain and start listening to love's call. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.